It's a pleasure to be here, and an even greater pleasure to be sitting with Nisid Hajari, who has written a fantastic book, which hopefully you will all buy and read. You'll see that I took a lot of notes, and don't worry, I'm not going to be reading from all those pages. But Nisid writes about Asian politics, history, and economics for a Bloomberg View, and he has spent time as a writer for Time Magazine, as an editor for Newsweek and Newsweek International. He has written for all the top publications in the US and some of the top ones in Britain. And, you know, as I said, his book, which came out earlier this year, Midnight's Furies, The Deadly Legacy of India's Partition, is the basis of what we're really going to talk about tonight. India and Pakistan have such a complex relationship. I had the honor of living in India and covering Pakistan as well for about 5 years, and I can tell you that I was learning something up to the moment I left, and that's what made it so stimulating to a place to write about. But in any case, it's it's great to have you. Thank you for joining us tonight. And what's also good is that there have been a lot of recent news events that I think really put this topic into sharper focus. I mean, even the nuclear test in Korea touches on an important piece of the relationship between India and Pakistan. We've had insurgent attacks on an Indian Air Force base near the border with Pakistan recently, and we also had the surprise summit between the prime ministers, Nawaz Sharif and Narendra Modi. So that definitely helps get us going. But what I'd like to do first is we only have an hour, so I want to ask you a very short one-answer question. Who's to blame for the problem? Don't
Easy.
answer. Don't answer. Actually, it's a three. Well, for Nisid, I'll spoil it. It's a three-word answer, not the British.
Yeah.
Anyway, actually, well, why 69 years after this event, which was well written about and kind of well known, what motivated you to write this book?
No, it was. It's the first question everyone asks. You know, there are if you go to Delhi, I started my research in New Delhi in beginning of 2011, and Delhi's really a partitioned city. A lot of the people who live there are descendants of refugees who came across from what is now Pakistan and moved there in 1947. So everybody has a story that they've heard from their grandmother, that they've heard in school, and the first thing they tell you is, "We know this. Why would you write about it?" And there were a couple of reasons. One was because I didn't think that the story that most people know is actually what happened. I mean, if you ask Indians what happened, they'll tell you one thing. If you ask Pakistanis what happened, they'll tell you a different thing. And obviously, they can't both be true, although there are elements in both that are true. And the second thing is, my family is originally from India, but I grew up here in the U.S. And this story is a sort of major part of the 20th century. It's very little known here because it's never been thought of as part of the American experience or relevant to the U.S. But I had just come out of spending 10 years at Newsweek, where I helped oversee our coverage of the war in Afghanistan. And the fundamental force that keeps that war going is Pakistan's support for the Taliban. And that support traces back to the reason they continue that support is because of their strategic anxiety about India. They're afraid of Indian influence in Afghanistan, and to keep that at bay, to undermine it, they will continue to tolerate and support the Afghan Taliban, even while they take billions of dollars in aid from the U.S. And that's something that I think confuses a lot of Americans, but makes a lot more sense if you see the world from the Pakistani point of view, where you have this neighbor that poses appears to pose an existential threat. That attitude, that fear of India, has built up over 69 years. It's been exacerbated by various wars and conflicts, but it was really set in a few months, really, in 1947, when the British left, when the country was split, when chaos broke out, these terrible riots in which anywhere from 200,000 to 1 million people were killed, really set this pattern, this rivalry between the two nations. And that was a story that I thought needed to be told again.
And you do connect those dots in your narrative. I mean, even a number of the quotes from the time actually sound very familiar in the current environment. And you point out, like even when you were talking about some of the battles, this is where the Taliban came from. This is So I mean, it really stemmed from actually as you were covering the Afghan war, but it didn't have to be this way, did it? I mean, you have said that that one of the things you also wanted to challenge was this notion that we got here and it was inevitable from the start.
Yeah, I think there's a real assumption that India and Pakistan, one is a Hindu-dominated nation, one's a Muslim nation, that of course they're going to hate each other. That this rivalry must go back centuries. I've done events for the book where people will stand up and start citing to me battles between the Mughals and some Hindu kingdom in whatever century, and to prove that of course once you decided to split the subcontinent, once you decided to create Pakistan, that inevitably the two countries would fight. And I don't think that's true. First of all, I don't think the country that became Pakistan, that is Pakistan now, is what the founder of Pakistan, Muhammad Ali Jinnah, intended. There is this. A lot of Indians today will tell you, this state, this Pakistani state, is inherently unstable. It's because it's defined, it's based on religion, that it's a state for Muslims. And while Jinnah intended Pakistan to be a state where Muslims would be a majority, which they wouldn't be if India had remained united, he never intended it to be a Muslim state. In his vision, the British would draw the border, everyone would stay where they were. And if they did, if that had happened, if every family had stayed exactly where they were living, Pakistan today would be maybe 52, 53% Muslim, barely. It would have been, it had a huge Hindu minority. It would have actually been a mixed state, the same way that India is today. And everybody in his mind would have had equal political rights, would have been able to worship freely. Islam would not have been the state religion. So many things had to happen before you ended up with where we are today. It wasn't inevitable at all.
Right. And so Jinnah was a secularist, Western educated, very articulate, thoughtful, and he had a counterpart on the Indian side, Nehru, who had actually a very similar background, and as you point out, they had close personal ties. What was that? Why didn't things then succeed?
Given
despite that, or was it because of those similarities that made this unworkable?
Yeah, it was partly because of what they had in common. I mean, these are two men that they're more similar to one another than either of them were to, say, Mahatma Gandhi, who was a much more religious figure, he was more comfortable using the language of Hinduism in his political appeals. Nehru and Jinnah were both very modern men. They were British educated, completely secular, as you said, both very vain. They really cared a lot about their, what they were wearing. They were ladies' men to a certain extent, and they were family friends, as it were. Jinnah, in his early political career, was a political ally of Nehru's father, and they worked together on various things, including trying to come to an agreement whereby Muslims would have a certain degree of representation in the parliament once the British left, and so on. But one of the things they shared is that they're very thin-skinned, and they had a split in the late 30s when Jinnah had gone into exile in London. He had had a very promising political career that was derailed when Gandhi came back to India. He left, he went back to London, he came back to India to revive his political party, tried to run in elections, wanted to partner with Nehru, who was in charge of the Congress Party at the time. And Nehru very publicly rejected him and humiliated him. And that both turned him off personally, but also gave Jinnah a foil. Nehru had this bad habit of sort of acting as though Muslim complaints or fears were unfounded, and that everyone should just trust him and trust Gandhi, and that things would be fine after the British left. And Jinnah could use that to drum up support for his movement for Pakistan, to say, look, if you don't support me, you're going to be overlooked. People like Nehru are going to be in charge. Hindus are going to rule over you, and your voice will not be heard. And once that ball started rolling, everything that one man or the other did was sort of seen through a certain lens. They really deeply disliked each other by the end. Nehru believed Jinnah was a medievalist. He hated the idea that you could base a political appeal on religion. Jinnah was a hard-nosed. He was a lawyer. He was a hard-nosed politician, and he thought Nehru was just flighty, slightly airheaded politician who couldn't be trusted. He wanted someone to negotiate with, and Nehru was too operating at a different level of principle.
Nehru hated his negotiations.
Absolutely hated it. Bored into tears to sit in these conference rooms and negotiate with right. Jinnah over, percentages of seats in the parliament and so on. He wanted to lead a revolution and kick the British out, and he operated on the level of principle.
Did Jinnah feel though that Nehru personally wanted to strangle Pakistan at birth, or was it that just Nehru wasn't strong enough to stop the other Congress members who wanted that?
I think the latter. I think Jinnah must have understood that Nehru and Gandhi, were not prejudiced in any way towards Muslims, and fought very hard. Once these riots broke out, there were a lot of people in India, including within the government of India, who didn't believe Muslims should stay in India anywhere, that they weren't trustworthy, that they were inherently going to support Pakistan, and that they should be kicked out. And one of the people who believed this was Nehru's deputy, Sardar Patel. And Jinnah, I think, believed that Patel did have malign intentions towards Pakistan. And he had, it has to be said, he had reason to believe this, because the Indian leaders would say things like, well, Pakistanis, just give them a couple of years and they'll realize they've made a mistake, and they'll want to rejoin India. They weren't going out of their way to reassure the Pakistanis that they accepted the division and were willing to work together.
Right, but it was more of a benign, okay, go have your little experiment.
Mm-hmm.
You'll come back to mother.
Exactly.
And you talked about how thin-skinned those two were. I mean, this thin skin and this kind of attachment to particular parts of South Asia also seemed to drive decisions. Nehru was attached to Kashmir, which didn't even have the real personal attachment. It was more of like a family myth attachment. Obviously Jinnah was attached to Punjab, which was where the biggest split came and the biggest violence. Right. Patel would go apoplectic if anyone wanted to take a piece of Gujarat away from him, Right. And so what comes across in the story very effectively is how emotion trumped rational thought, not just among the masses. I mean, we're talking about among the leaders who were making these decisions. Yeah. So jumping forward to today, is that still the dynamic at work between the leaderships of the two countries?
Emotion plays a large role, definitely. I think, because this rivalry has built up over 70 years, both sides have built up these sorts of images of one another, and of the Indians assume the Pakistanis are constantly trying to undermine them, trying to foment these terrorist attacks, trying to seize Kashmir. The Pakistanis still believe that India doesn't believe that they should exist. And so what happens is when you have a certain movement towards peace, as you have that's going on right now, it's very easy for it to be derailed, because one small terrorist attack will suddenly set off all these stereotypes about the other. It fulfills all of India's worst fears about Pakistan, and it's very easy then to just cut off any attempts at a rapprochement. And that's something that they're going to have to get over. It's going to take a long time for, I think, ordinary people and for the media on both sides to give this up. But that's why you need leaders to show some sort of statesmanship to overcome it.
and how would you assess the current leaders? On one hand, we have Nawaz Sharif, who's been in and out of power and in and out of exile.
Right.
And you have Narendra Modi, who is kind of well, I'm exaggerating here, but I mean, he's leading the first majority BJP, absolute majority BJP government, which of course was the position that Congress was in for many years until this transition. How do you, Modi has been there for a year and a half now. How do you sort of assess the quality of their leadership and their relationship? Because compared to the founders, they don't know each other at all.
No, but they are, they're both businessmen, as it were. I mean, Modi is a government executive, but Sharif is a Punjabi businessman. He's always been pro-trade with India and closer relations with India. Modi, I think, recognized that early on and invited Sharif to his inauguration, which was a bold move, but he didn't follow it up. And it's not clear to me exactly why, whether it was, there were provocations from the Pakistanis, but they were fairly minor. And it may have been because Modi was trying to play to his own base. Maybe he didn't feel that he had the political strength to stand up against them. Maybe he didn't think it was important enough. I mean, I think he also, like a lot of Indians, thought that it was safe to ignore Pakistan, that he could deal with China, he could deal with the U.S., that Pakistan was this minor nuisance that if you just sort of, put up your defenses against them, you could safely ignore. He seems to have changed his mind recently. I think this latest trip, he went to Lahore in a surprise trip on Christmas Day to meet Sharif, and that was a breakthrough that set up these talks that are supposed to start this weekend. Right. And it's, I think he recognizes now, whether he recognizes himself, whether Obama encouraged him to, who knows, that this India will never be the great global power it wants to be if it doesn't resolve its relationship with Pakistan. If you're always looking over your shoulder, if you're engaged in a nuclear arms race with your neighbor, you just cannot have the kind of influence you would want within South Asia, within Asia writ large, and within the global system. So I think he does understand that now. And the good news is, if any Indian leader can make a deal with Pakistan, it's a right-wing leader like Modi. It can't be the Congress Party. It has to be
Nixon in China, Sadat in Egypt.
Exactly.
I mean, Begin in Egypt. But
yeah. So the real question is actually not what Nawaz Sharif thinks now, but what Raheel Sharif, who is no relation to him, but is the head of the army in Pakistan, what he thinks, and nobody really knows exactly what that is.
And so, again, going back to partition, because this was, of all the things, Pakistan was left with the minor share of everything. I mean, it didn't, as you point out, it didn't even have a mint. It didn't have anything to print money. It lost a lot of its professional core. There were Hindus who were actually a majority in Karachi, and a lot of people in Lahore came over. But the one thing that it did get in abundance was the British Army. The Pakistani army that was oversized at the start and continues to have this really very difficult to penetrate relationship with the political, with civilian leaders. And of course, most of Pakistan, at least half, has been under military dictatorship. So where do you see things today? I mean, keeping in mind that Nawaz Sharif was embarrassed by the man who eventually overthrew him with the 1999 invasion of Kargil in Kashmir.
Yeah. No, I mean, the army, the Pakistani army is unquestionably still the most important force in Pakistan. It is, they don't need to be in power to influence the government. They've set down pretty clear markers. Nawaz Sharif, the prime minister, can do what he wants with economic policy. If he wants to negotiate with Bangladesh or Sri Lanka, that's fine. But relations with India are the province of the Pakistani army, and that's also okay. I mean, it's not ideal, but as everybody knows this, and I don't think there's an assumption, I think, among a lot of Indians that the Pakistani army doesn't want peace with India. And there are a lot of reasons why they wouldn't want peace with India, including the fact that they make a lot of money off of having a state of tension with India. It allows them to demand more of the budget and to portray themselves as the sort of defenders of the nation against India, and so therefore they have to maintain a certain degree of political influence as well. So tensions benefit them. At the same time, I think they're smart enough to know that tensions are not exactly bankrupting them, but it's not good for their economy. It's not good for stability. China is now planning to invest billions of dollars in infrastructure in Pakistan. And the last thing they want is a war between India and Pakistan. They don't mind a little bit of tension, but they don't want terrorist groups running around Pakistan, blowing up pipelines that they've funded, and so on. So I think the Pakistani army also understands that stability is in their interests. I don't think we would have even gotten as far as we have with these talks with India if General Sharif had not okayed them.
Right.
Even though he hasn't, I don't think he said anything publicly about them.
Right.
Not much.
So it's in the background, but it's always hard to know exactly where the power lies. I mean, yes, the military for sure, but how far it's willing to let the titular head of state go.
Go ahead. Yeah. I mean, I think the real test, I think, will be if these talks go ahead. The smart thing to do, the obvious thing to do, would be to look for certain low-hanging fruit, to come to agreements on a few things that should be relatively uncontroversial, and build on that to get to more complicated things like Kashmir. So trade, for instance, Sharif has been pushing for years to grant India most favored nation status. India already grants this to Pakistan, and to lower trade barriers so that people can make money. The army allowed this to progress for years up until 2013, and then they started to slow down progress on it. If they let Sharif go ahead with that, then I think that's a pretty good sign that they're willing to see where this process goes. If they won't even let him do that, then it'll be a little harder to believe that you can make progress.
Right. Does the BJP, which is more avowedly Hindu, it plays up Hinduism and Hindus, which makes, I mean, does that make Pakistan, does that perpetuate Pakistan's sense of insecurity? I mean, do you get the sense now, though, that there's a maturity in the military leadership in Pakistan and in the political leadership that India understands Pakistan is there to stay? It is not a passing fancy.
I think they probably accept that. But the danger is that in any country you have sort of a spectrum a political spectrum, both within politics and within the military. So a lot of Indian generals and Air Force commanders and things have been itching for a while to hit back against Pakistan if there is another terrorist attack like there was in this airbase. And India has very strong civilian control of its military. No general is going to be allowed to go off and do his own thing. But you hear people talking within military forums, at conferences, and so on about, we're going to give a befitting reply the next time there's an attack, and we can Indians talk about how if there is another Mumbai-style terrorist attack, that they won't just sit by like they did last time. They will conduct supposedly pinpoint strikes on terrorist infrastructure within Pakistan. All of which is nonsense. I mean, nobody, there is no terrorist infrastructure to bomb, and there's no way to bomb it without provoking a military response from Pakistan. And hopefully the civilian leaders understand this, and hopefully the Pakistanis understand that you shouldn't take everything some random Indian general says as gospel, but it's not helpful. And I think this is where Modi himself has been very careful about the way he's talked about Pakistan. He's been very responsible, but by encouraging a sort of nationalist fervor, it allows supporters or people underneath him to be a little more extreme than they might have been otherwise in their statements. And it's incumbent upon Modi to cut that back in the same way that he wasn't necessarily encouraging any anti-Muslim sentiment within India in the last few months, but it was expanding, and he probably had a responsibility to pull the reins on some of his supporters.
Right, and you talk about how Modi is being careful with what he says. I mean, words in in emotional cultures like that can, sort of cause unintended consequences, as you show over and over and over in the, at the time of partition, that Nehru and Jinnah didn't quite appreciate how the impact that their words had on the masses, on the people, and then they were also willing to believe rumors and reports, kind of the worst case scenario of everything. So I guess in today, I mean, that was before the internet, that was telegraphs, no telephones even that much time. So now nuclear arms, more proxies than anyone knows, and they're out of control, and the internet. What is the what is the potential for destructive disinformation? And
that's actually the real fear. Somebody pointed out to me, there's this sense that India and Pakistan have been fighting somehow for, since birth. They haven't actually fought a war since 1999, but they're at war every single day on cable TV. There's, if you watch Indian TV, especially if there's any sort of minor provocation, it is, red flashing lights and headlines and exclamation points and screaming top pundits, and you would think World War III was about to happen, and it's the leader's responsibility to sort of tamp that down. I mean, you can't stop it. It's a free press. It's a freewheeling media scene there, and that's all to the good. But you do need your leaders to sort of be more responsible and act themselves in a way that doesn't encourage this, and then it'll slow down of its own accord, I think.
The other thing that you've noted, partition affected so many people. In some ways, it affected so few people in the whole subcontinent, but it affected so many people. The largest population transfer in history, and we're 69 years beyond it. There are fewer and fewer survivors of that era, and they're younger and more tech savvy and more worldly populations, growing middle classes in both of these countries. But yet, you seem to, in your research and your travels, you found that hasn't softened the view of the other side, but quite the opposite. Why don't you explain that?
It's a little depressing in that sense. I mean, the vast majority of people on both sides of the border were born after partition, and again in India in particular, it's really only North India that was affected by partition. I mean, my own family is from the Bombay area in Gujarat, in Maharashtra, but Gujarat state, and they weren't affected at all by these refugee flows, by these riots, and so on. But it's the younger generation. All they know of this story, all they know of Pakistan, is what they read in the media, what they were taught in school, and what they're taught in school is a very one-sided view of partition. That Jinnah was this evil megalomaniac who craved power and wanted to split the subcontinent in order to have a state that he could rule of his own. And then ever since then, Pakistan has been trying to undermine India in order to regain Kashmir. People are very intensely nationalistic. It's very easy to get into this almost more mob mentality when it comes to Pakistan. So it's not a personal thing anymore. But the animosity, the passions are not fading with time. They're going to have to, and part of that, the reason is because these two peoples don't know each other at all. It's almost impossible to go across the border if you have an Indian passport. It is, you can do it. There's one bus service. You can get a visa, but it's incredibly complicated. And every time you talk to anyone who has done it, who a lot of people will take their aging parents across to see where their family was originally find their original home, and they always come back and say, "My God, they were so nice. They were so generous. People showed us around. They had us over for dinner. They were just like us." And you want to shake them and say, what did you think they were going to be like? I mean, it's the same people, the same culture, same language, same food. And if you just sort of opened the border a bit more and had people going back and forth and had students studying in either side, had journalists working in each country, a lot of these stereotypes, a lot of the myths would decline. And I think until you do that, though, it's very easy to demonize the other, as the source of all your problems.
Right. I mean, the tragic irony, as you point out, is that at the time of partition, there were no two countries more similar in the world than Pakistan and India, and now they hardly know each other.
Yeah, exactly.
But do you believe they're still similar?
They are still very similar. I think that the deep cultural aspects don't change. That India is they're economically different now. India is a much bigger, much more powerful country. It's much more open, I think, socially. Pakistan's been getting much more conservative over the last 10, 15 years. And they also, on the downside, share a lot of the same problems. They share massive inequality, problems with human development indicators, all these things that they should be working together to solve, and could learn from each other in solving. It's a shame that they're not right now.
What do you think is the most effective route to solving that? Is it economic relations?
Yeah, I do think it's trade. I think it's the most obvious way. You're not going to solve Kashmir immediately. I mean, everyone knows what the eventual deal in Kashmir is going to be. That's going to be, basically, right now India controls about a third of Kashmir, Pakistan controls about a third, and then China controls about a third. But it's sort of inaccessible, and nobody really wants it anyway. And the deal is going to be that everybody gets to keep the Kashmir that they have, and that's it. But it's going to take years to get to that point. But in the meantime, you are very, very close to having open trade relations between the two. It'd be very simple to allow that to happen. And once you do that, right now there's about $3 billion of trade between the two. It should be 10 times that much. And if you can get the levels up that high, then you start to have lobbyists, businessmen on both sides who are making money, who have something invested in peace and stability rather than in conflict. And it's been shown. You look at China and Taiwan, Japan and China, other places where people have very intense historical animosities. Once they become economically interdependent, all that stuff, it doesn't go away, but it gets tamped down, and you have a buffer. So when something happens, when there is a terrorist attack, people understand that they still have things to gain from one another rather than just to lose.
And stakes in each other's stability.
Exactly.
Right. So now I'm going to go back to part of the answer of your first question, the Taliban, and arguably what could disrupt a rapprochement is extremism, religious extremism. Now, obviously, the story of partition is about sectarian strife. On so many different layers. Yet, and it wasn't intentionally fomented by the leadership, by Jinnah and Nehru, let's say, but inadvertently, or they were secularists until they weren't, and but it seems, and you point out in the book that each leader ultimately was more concerned about his own extremists, not the others, and so now. Are we at that point of reckoning in Pakistan, where maybe you can talk about how, why you talked about why it helped support the Taliban, and now it's got the backlash. So does Pakistan is it going to act on this sense and this fear, not of India, but of its own of Islamic extremists?
That's the $64,000 question. They say they will. Right. There was about a year ago, December of 2014, there was this terrible attack on an army-run school in Peshawar, where dozens of school children were massacred by the Pakistani Taliban.
Right.
And ever since then, the army has said that they will go after all militants, and they won't distinguish between the ones that only attack India and the ones that attack the Pakistani state. They have, in reality, thus far, only really gone after the Pakistani Taliban, the ones that attack them directly. If challenged on this, they will say, and this is realistic, that they can't afford to take on everybody at once. That if these groups do have connections, they share recruits, they share intelligence, they share training. If they decided to start arresting the leaders of some militant groups that attack India, and they all turned against the state at once, they wouldn't be able to handle that. It's a fair point, but it's not sufficient because the longer you wait, the more chances these groups have to launch attacks like the most recent one in India. The greater chances of there being a war between India and Pakistan, and nobody else can do it. The Pakistani army has to fundamentally believe that these militants are the greatest threat to its stability. I think a lot of people in Pakistan are convinced of that. I think there are some people within the Pakistani military who may not be yet, but they're headed in the right direction. It's just they're definitely not there yet.
Mm-hmm. So, and then on the other side of the border, you have the BJP. Now, Narendra Modi, as you pointed out, is rising above the sectarian politics. But, he was obviously a part of his rise in Gujarat as chief minister. During that time, there were very serious sectarian riots. And so I'm going to start incorporating the many questions we've gotten from the audience. They're really good. And so how does he rise above that past, but at the same time placate his right wing?
I think first of all, I don't think he needs to placate his right wing. I don't think his right wing has anywhere else to go.
Right.
There's no other leader that they're going to elect. They may stay home, they may not help him, and
right.
but they're not exactly helping him in these kind of state elections anyway. The most recent state elections, which he lost, were marked by he was helped by these people. They were drumming up fairly anti-Muslim rhetoric, and it backfired. It didn't work at all for him. So I'm not sure that these are people that he wants to be placating right now. He could do more and should do more in terms of speaking out against them. I mean, I think about my current employer. I work at Bloomberg now, and I don't know if you guys remember, but a few years ago when there was a controversy over whether or not to build a mosque down near Ground Zero, a lot of national politicians backpedaled as fast as they could away from the issue and were saying, let's not do it, it's too controversial, we don't want to offend anybody. And Bloomberg came out, he was mayor of New York at the time, and gave a speech on Ellis Island, I believe, and said, no, this is not the country we are, this is not the city we are. Everybody has a right to worship here, and we're going to allow this mosque to be, it wasn't even a mosque, but we're going to allow it to be built. That's a moment that Modi has never had. For as strong a leader as he is, he's a famous tough guy, he talks about his 56-inch chest, he hasn't had the political courage to stand up and say to his followers, no, this is not the kind of country we are. This is not India. Muslims are full citizens here, they're welcome. He's dodged around the issue, he's hedged, he's sort of had subordinates go out and say similar things. He needs to have that moment, and I fail to see what he could lose from it. I don't see him losing so much support that it's going to hurt him in any other way. But that's the only thing that will. He's the only one who has the credibility to say that. Right. If he sends his subordinates to say it, everyone thinks that he doesn't really believe it. So it's going to take him speaking out publicly to put this stuff to rest.
So that will be on the domestic side. What does he need? You mentioned in a recent op-ed that Modi, or India, well, Modi, I guess specifically, also needs to give Pakistan a reason to feel less insecure.
Yeah.
So what does he need to say to Pakistan?
Yeah, sort of what he's doing right now. That he has to say that India has more invested in Pakistan's stability and growth than not. That it's no longer a question of whether Pakistan deserves to exist, whether it should have ever been created. It is there. It's a fact. It's not going anywhere. And India should want a strong, stable, prosperous, economically growing Pakistan. There's no question that is the best outcome for India. And there are things he could do to make that concrete. So, for example, Pakistan, it's up to Pakistan to grant India most favored nation status. The Pakistanis will say, well, look, even if we do that, even if we lift these tariffs, India has all these sorts of complicated rules that prevent Pakistani goods from coming over. They won't let our businessmen have visas and so on. They make things very hard. And that's true. And Modi could do quite a bit to lift those barriers, to cut back on red tape, to improve the infrastructure at the border so Pakistani trucks can come over faster and get processed and so on. These are concrete things he could do to show that India means business. And in the end, India will benefit far more than Pakistan will economically from this. It's in his interest to do so. They shouldn't be thought of as concessions, right? These are things that are in the best interest of India to do, and they would also reassure ordinary Pakistanis as well. I mean, the Pakistani military, needs a different kind of massaging, but that's something that should be done more behind the scenes, I think.
Right. Well, actually, there are a lot of questions about that, but let me just stay with building trust and lessening the fear of insecurity in Pakistan. India is quite diplomatically active in Afghanistan now, right? Which had been the sort of the no, I'm not going to say the vassal state, but Pakistan's territory, and hence the Taliban. Is there room for both? I mean, can both be can India continue this policy of helping the government of Afghanistan and improve relations with Pakistan, or will that continue to fuel the kind of fear of encirclement?
They have to be careful about it. I mean, I think Afghanistan wants Indian aid. The Indians trained Pakistani legislators. They built the parliament building. They've built building roads and schools and so on. And Afghanistan needs all the help it can get. So I think it's perfectly legitimate for India to have a role in Afghanistan, and Pakistan has to accept that. Now, you want to be as transparent as possible about it, and not allow fears, suspicions, paranoias about what are these Indian diplomats doing? Are they spies? Or this or that? You've got to have. That's where it's important to have an ongoing dialogue with Pakistan about all sorts of issues, and this can be one of them, where you need to talk about what it is you're doing and why you're doing it. There's no way. I mean, this is all part of the same region, right? The best outcome again is for all three countries to benefit from closer ties. So to give you an example, right now trucks from Afghanistan can't cross Pakistan and go into India and sell goods in India. That's something that the Pakistanis could allow to have happen, could charge transit fees for it, make quite a bit of money off of it, and would tie their three economies together more closely. There's a famous pipeline that's supposed to come down through those three countries to bring gas to India. That would help. All these things would increase Indian influence in Afghanistan, their presence, but it would be much more open and something that everybody could understand, and somebody that everybody could benefit from as well.
So here's a question from the audience. How does, still in Afghanistan, how does Pakistan see Afghanistan in 5 or 10 years, and how can the U.S. use this position in support of U.S. objectives for South Asian stability?
Well, unfortunately, I think right now Pakistan still sees Afghanistan as you say, as a little bit of a vassal state.
Right.
They want to be the dominant influence in Kabul. They don't trust the Indians still. They do fear encirclement, and so the Pakistanis will want to have some degree of influence over whatever government exists in Kabul. Understandable, but again, I don't think it's something the U.S. should be encouraging. I mean, this is something that the Afghans have to decide how much influence they want and from whom, and they have a lot of legitimate suspicions about the Pakistanis. They believe the Pakistanis have been supporting the Taliban, have been trying to undermine them for years now. A lot of people, especially from the northern half of the country, don't want any Pakistani influence there, and you can't force it upon them. This has to be something that is accepted willingly. So, while Pakistan has legitimate security interests in the region, they can't be catered to exclusively. They have to be taken into account, but that's it.
And following on from that, a question is, what can the U.S. do to strengthen the civilian government in Pakistan to lessen the influence of the army over foreign policy and regional activity?
It's a tough one. I mean, it's always easier to deal with the army because it seems like a more straightforward relationship. You give them some planes and some helicopters, and you will get
or
what
you
you
don't.
want. Or you don't.
Or you sell it to them and you don't give it to them.
Right.
Yeah.
And somehow you think that this is going to get the reaction that you want. It's never worked. So why we think this is still going to, it doesn't mean you shouldn't give it to them, but, don't think you're necessarily going to get what you want in return for it. It's more, you do need to, we spend billions on the Pakistani military and much, much less on civilian aid, building up institutions, training, having exchanges, and so on. We could do a lot more to build up the capacity of the civilian government. It's still not going to change the fact that the army is more influential, but if you have a really well-functioning civilian government, which you haven't had to this point, you've had a lot of weak, fairly corrupt governments. It's very easy for the army to say to ordinary Pakistanis, "Look, you can't trust these civilians. We're the clean institution. We're the one that can hold the country together." But if you have a civilian government that actually works, that is producing economic growth, then it starts to lessen the appeal of the army a bit. So that's something that I think the U.S. can help.
Why do we? It's not like China would rush in to give a lot of military aid to Pakistan if the U.S. didn't. That's not really the direction China seems to want to go, or am I wrong? So who would, if we didn't, if we cut down aid or shifted it to more civilian aid, and what would Pakistan's recourse be?
It might be China, actually. China does have pretty strong military ties. Right. Mostly it's they don't talk much about their support for the nuclear program and their missile program, but it is fairly strong. The Chinese don't make the kinds of weapons that we do, and so it's not what the Pakistanis want.
No, they've had ours for years.
But they could turn there. They could turn to the Russians, so on. The problem is we give this weaponry to them on fairly cheap terms, and they can't afford to buy it themselves. I guess the worry would be the reason we keep doing it is because we're afraid that if we don't do it, that it will make them even more paranoid and unstable, and that they'll somehow lash out
or start investing ISI, setting the ISI loose on on the proxies and things like that.
Yeah, but this is a fear that the Pakistanis cultivate.
Right.
They've been very good at this. They try and encourage this fear in Washington, and it keeps it keeps the aid flowing. So at a certain point, the U.S. also has to have the courage to say no. We're gonna take a chance here and see what happens.
Which brings us to nuclear weapons. Several questions about the likelihood of a nuclear war and who would fire first. Well, we know India has pledged not to.
Mm-hmm. And Pakistan is not.
Right.
So it is. Yeah. It's. I wouldn't exaggerate it. It's. I think the chances of a war are still slim, but it's very worrying. And North Korea gets a lot of the headlines because you've got the crazy dictator with the bad haircut and everything. But this is the one place in the world where you have two nuclear armed powers. And India has a fairly restrained nuclear posture. They're like China. They have about 100 nuclear weapons, and it's enough. They know they have enough to respond if they're attacked, and they think that's enough of a deterrent. The Pakistanis have about the same now, but their arsenal is continuing to grow, and they're building tactical nuclear weapons, these smaller battlefield nukes, and they have not. They've essentially said that they will use them. That if India, let's say there's a massive armored strike from India across the border into Pakistan, they reserve the right to set off a small nuclear weapon, against Indian military forces, to somehow deter them from continuing and overrunning Pakistan, which is a sort of crazy way of going about things, because the U.S. and the Soviets also had battlefield nukes. They gamed this out. There is no way that you can guarantee that this will not lead to escalation. Not to mention the fact that the nuclear fallout, even from a small attack, would flow back into Pakistan, not necessarily into India. But it's very destabilizing to have this. It both, once you start spreading these battlefield nukes out to frontline commanders, first of all, you give more responsibility to the commander. It's possible one of them could launch an attack. And it makes it easier to steal these weapons because they're not sort of locked in a silo somewhere. They're out on the front lines. So all in all, it's very dangerous. It is something that the U.S. is very conscious of and is talking to the Pakistanis about quietly. The U.S. came to
the security of the arsenal.
Security of the arsenal,
Right.
and also the need or lack thereof for these weapons. The U.S. learned from experience. They had battlefield nuclear weapons in Europe, and they pulled them out because it was too destabilizing, and it was not clear that it would do any good. Even if you set one off in the middle of a tank column, you wouldn't necessarily destroy the whole column. They're just not militarily that effective, and they're incredibly destabilizing. And I think the U.S. and I hope China, I don't know for a fact, there's some signs that China is part of these discussions, should be talking to the Pakistanis about why they don't need these things and why it's actually against their interest to deploy them.
But going to the security, a number of questions about the security of the nuclear arsenal. Right, there's a lot of focus on Korea, but Pakistan has a much bigger arsenal and a much more porous state. Is the military, in your assessment and to your knowledge, I mean, is it secure? And does India believe it's secure in the U.S.?
I think it's relatively secure. The U.S. has spent a lot of money in the last few years working with the Pakistanis to improve the security, to train. They have a separate force dedicated just to defending their strategic assets. The problem is that the Pakistanis don't trust us. They don't want to let us know exactly how secure they are or how they're securing them because they're afraid we're going to take them. And every now and then, some U.S. Special Forces officer will pop off about how we do have plans to take them, and I'm sure we do. I'm sure we have options on hand for trying to see contingencies, right?
Not a
right.
conspiracy.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. But as we should, honestly. But we don't know exactly where they all are. We can't guarantee we're going to get all of them. It's not. You can't really count on that. The SEALs swooping in and somehow seizing all these weapons and getting back out again, and everything will be fine. So it's a problem. We should be working more closely with them on the security, but we can't as long as they fear that we actually covet them.
In 1998, I think it was, when Clinton fired Tomahawks or some kind of cruise missile into Afghanistan, I happened to be flying from India to Pakistan that night, and I landed, and when I got to Islamabad, there were all these American military transport planes there. And later that night, the attack came. And what it turned out is that, I forget the name of the general, was sent to Pakistan basically to hold their hands, to make them understand that these missiles flying over their territory were not from India.
Yeah.
Would that be necessary today?
Yeah, no, definitely. I mean, I think the Pakistanis are incredibly on alert against anything like that from India. It's part of the challenge, though, right? That you can't share all this information. The reason we didn't tell them about the Bin Laden raid is because we didn't trust that they wouldn't try and stop it. But they still, they've shifted. The Pakistanis have shifted a lot of their military assets from the India border to the west, to the Afghan border, to combat the Pakistani Taliban. But they still have huge forces on that side, and are on if not hair trigger alert, at least fairly high alert. I mean, it's easy to forget. This has been going on for so long that and you don't hear about it that much. It doesn't make the headlines. You forget that thousands of troops are on these borders, facing each other, and again, they're not going to suddenly launch an attack, but it would be very easy for another Mumbai-style attack to. They would be much faster now. That what they've worked on since then, the Indians have worked to get much faster at being able to respond. That time it took them days, if not weeks, to build up enough forces to attack. They want to be able to get to that stage within days now, and that just makes the Pakistanis more afraid and more paranoid. So it's a vicious cycle. It's the only way to break out of it. It's got to be a political solution, because you'll never solve it militarily.
And there isn't great communication
Between the militaries.
Between the
Exactly.
militaries.
Right.
So I want to ask this question on ISIS. The question is, so much of our attention in the region recently has focused on Islamic State. Does the group's influence have an impact on Pakistan or India?
Fortunately, not so much yet. They've talked about it. But it's and there's some. I would say there's some Taliban splinter groups in Afghanistan who suddenly claim to be part of ISIS, but they're really just disgruntled Taliban that started waving the black flag. There's no real sign of IS influence in India or even Pakistan. It's something to worry about, but I think there are bigger worries. I mean, there are a lot of well-established terrorist groups already inside Pakistan that have shown the ability to not only to attack within India, but to attack much further afield. ISIS is more of a slogan at this point. There, I don't think it hasn't shown to have much appeal, as far as I know, among young Pakistanis, or you don't get a lot of Pakistanis going to Syria to fight. Partly because if they really wanted to fight, they would just go across the border to Afghanistan. They don't need to as much. So, I guess that's a positive in one way.
What about within radical Islamic groups inside of India?
They're much more focused on India. Oh, sorry, within India.
Within India, but that might. I mean, of course, they could fall under the influence of all the many in the region. But I mean, in any case,
they could. I would probably be a little more worried. But Al-Qaeda has established a branch for South Asia, and I think they are probably a more dangerous option. They're better established. They've got better networks, and Al-Qaeda has long wanted to spark a war between India and Pakistan, because they believe that this would sort of rally Muslims again to this fight. So that would be a bigger worry for me than Islamic State as of now. I mean, it could change over time, but I'm not too worried about that. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. To get off that depressing subject of nuclear war and radicalism, a question from the audience: what role do the arts play in building the bridge between the two countries? Bollywood is very popular in Pakistan, and Pakistani dramas are popular in India because of the internet. Is the sharing of culture negligible in terms of the larger population and potential political impact?
It's not negligible. I think it's one element. I mean, this has to be. I was saying earlier to somebody that this process can't just be. You can't just judge it based on, well, are Modi and Sharif going to meet, or are the militaries going to talk to one another? Yes, Modi and Sharif have to meet, and the militaries have to talk to one another, and businessmen have to trade, and artists have to go back and forth across the border and perform. If you have to send, it was depressing recently. Some Pakistani authors came over to India and were trying to give a reading in Bombay, and they were attacked by these right-wing Hindus, and paint was thrown on them and so on. And I was at a literary festival a few weeks later in Bombay, and there were 4 Pakistani authors who had been invited, and their names, they were still there and they still spoke, but their names were taken off the program and the sign, because the owner of the venue where the festival was taking place was afraid that if it was known that they were going to be there, that these mobs would come and try and disrupt things and destroy part of his facility. Again, understandable fear, but it's terrible. That's the last thing. You should want more of these authors coming over. You need these kind of both academic ties, artistic ties. These people are more influential than your average citizen. They have a voice, they have a platform, and they can sort of go back and write or speak on TV or do whatever, and give people a more accurate picture of what the other side looks like. So as long as, I mean, you can rent a mob in Bombay fairly easily, as you know. You just it's not hard, and you can't.
It's called a vote bank.
Yeah, exactly. And Mumbai is now governed by a right-wing Hindu party, not the BJP but Shiv Sena. Again, this is something that the government, the Modi on down, has to put a stop to, because you want more of these sorts of exchanges, not fewer of them.
Right. You've addressed this a little bit, but let's just revisit it, because it ends with the question that I also want to ask. When Modi was elected, there was a lot of optimism around mending the relationship with Pakistan. What has actually happened, but which you've answered partly. But now let's go to the forward-looking thing. Are you optimistic?
I like to say that I'm optimistic. I wouldn't put money on it, but I think the path forward is clear. It's logical. It is, as I said, you start increasing trade, you start increasing people-to-people ties, you get the militaries talking to one another, you get the political leaders talking to one another, and you look for low-hanging fruit, you pluck it when you can, and you just keep moving steadily forward. And it's going to be 2 steps forward, 1 back, and you have to know that, and you have to just keep pushing forward. I think there's no inherent reason why these 2 countries should be enemies. There's a sense, again, somehow that this is a civilizational battle, that somehow Hindus and Muslims can't get along, and these 2 countries are doomed to fight. And I hope the book shows that that's not the case at all. That if a few things had gone differently in 1947, it's entirely possible that these 2 countries could have been allies, or at least have a decent neighborly relationship with one another. There's nothing inevitable about it, and I have to hope that Indians and Pakistanis are no different than Americans or Canadians or French, or they want security for their families, they want education, they want to be able to make a living. And if you get both sides focused more on that and give them opportunities, and if Pakistanis can see that they're gaining benefits from closer ties with India, I think you're steadily going to move in the right direction. So I would say over the long term, again, as younger generations come up and so on, I am optimistic, but it's going to take work. It's not just going to happen naturally. You have to rewrite textbooks. You have to change the media. You have to increase these ties and open these borders and so on. And that's hard. It's hard. It's patient work, but I think they can do it.
One of the ways that Pakistan became a country that Jinnah did not want was the Islamization of society, of politics, but most recently, the military. What are your observations about the trend now? Certainly during the 90s and the early noughts, the concern was that the military was sort of becoming more of an orthodox religious organization. Any sense on the trend there?
That's still worrying. It is true. There was a real movement in the 80s to Islamicize the whole country, but in particular the military. And those young officers, or people who were young officers then, are now becoming senior officers. And there definitely is, the army is much more Islamic now than it used to be, and that's worrying. When you see things like Saudi Arabia trying to enlist Pakistan in their war in Yemen or the war against Iran, that's dangerous. The last thing you want is the Arab world thinking of the Pakistani bomb as a sort of Muslim bomb that they can tap into. And a big part of this is the religious education, the madrasa system in Pakistan. They've talked about madrasa reform for years now. Very little has been done about it. You still have the public school system is so terrible that it makes perfect sense for families to want to send their kids, especially poor families, to send their kids to religious schools where they don't have to pay for them. They'll be fed and housed, and they will only get a religious education. They won't have a sort of modern mindset. that's something that is the responsibility of the civilian government as well as the army to take care of, that they need to invest in improving the public education system, even as they crack down on these sort of radical madrasas that are training kids.
Mm-hmm. You alluded to it earlier, but so you want to be optimistic, and there is some reason to be, but why is it? And you cover all of Asia, and you write about all of Asia. But why is it? We're celebrating the 70th anniversary of the end of World War II, mm-hmm. Yet, and we've had integration in Europe mm-hmm. for a long time, and again, families who can quote battles going back to the 11th century are living side by side. France and Germany are allies, and they're the heart of the EU, which is maybe not saying so much right now. But why is it not only for India and Pakistan? Why is it for Asia? Why did it take 70 years just to get the comfort women agreement between Japan and Korea a few weeks ago? Why can't China and Taiwan have reconciled, they can get along, but why is Asia unable to overcome the scars of that era?
Yeah, it's interesting. Different parts of Asia have a harder time with it than others, and I think it has to do with the way history is taught. If you go to Korea now, Japan did terrible things during World War II, but Korean textbooks teach kids essentially that the Japanese were these almost evil beasts that are responsible for all of Korea's modern problems, and if you grow up with this sort of thing, it becomes very hard to see the other side as a right. legitimate partner. By contrast, if you look at Southeast Asia, Singapore and Malaysia, for instance, had tension. Singapore and Indonesia. All of Southeast Asia and Japan. I mean, Japan's rule during World War II in Southeast Asia was equally terrible. But after the war, Japanese companies invested in Southeast Asia. They're well integrated in the economies there. They sent tons of aid. And you will not find any anti-Japanese sentiment in Southeast Asia now. That particular region has been more like the U.S. It's been better at rebounding, looking forward, not getting bogged down in the past. India and Pakistan, Japan and China. History is a political weapon. Right. It's something that modern governments, modern leaders use as a political tool, and it becomes something to argue over rather than something to sort of examine dispassionately. And again, you can argue it over academically, but you move on from it. There's when Americans talk about history, Americans will argue about the Civil War, they'll argue about Vietnam, they'll argue about World War II, but there's that saying, it's just history, right? It's something that we're able to slough off in a way that these societies, I think, would benefit from boxing it off, looking at it more clearly, being open to having their views challenged by the other side. There are some projects in India and Pakistan, I know, to develop a joint textbook mm-hmm. where you integrate the Indian and Pakistani narratives of partition. And so you can see side by side what each one is telling their kids, and then there's a sort of in-between version where historians try and split the difference, as it were. Things like that need to happen more in order to influence the next generation.
And do you believe your book, by going into great detail about all the horror, will actually help heal those wounds?
You can only hope. I mean, it's one book. It's not,
it's,
if 1.3 billion Indians bought it, I would be extremely happy. And it would both encourage world peace and do lots of other good things. But
maybe it becomes the textbook.
Yeah. No, I mean, it's both been slightly depressing to go to India and have people sort of repeat the same narrative that you keep hearing. It's like, but isn't this what happened? And you have to say, no, it wasn't. And but then others who have read the book, are pleasant. I've been pleasantly surprised to see them say, I didn't realize that, and that makes sense, and so on. I think people can have an open mind, mm-hmm. And I hope it does. It's one small thing that can help in that direction.
I hope by opening the book, it will open their minds. And Anyway, that's all we have time for tonight. On behalf of the World Affairs Council and Asia Society Northern California, please join me in thanking Nisid Hajari for this very interesting evening.